How's it going, y'all? I'm Crysis, and I guess I loved movies a lot more than normal in March because holy shit, I saw a lot of them. Strap in because this review cycle is going to be a lot longer than the last few, considering I saw more movies this month than the last two combined. So, without any further dilly dallying, let's get into the reviews. First on the docket this month was a movie by the name of Cleaner, starring Daisy Ridley and the guy that plays Sanji in the live action One Piece thingy on Netflix, Taz Skylar. And I just gotta say, ugh. With a name like Cleaner, I wasn't expecting this to be good, and boy was I right. Daisy Ridley does fine in her role as Joey, a British Army dropout turned window cleaner, for some reason, thrust into an impossible scenario of stopping a terrorist plot, but the story is where this movie lost me constantly. The group carrying out the attack makes sense on the surface, but when you think about it, it just makes no sense unless you go into the movie knowing the end of it already. The action was fine, I guess, but it wasn't enough to save this movie from just being another schlocky hour and a half time waster that you see on the weekend because you have nothing better to do. And for that, it gets a 4 out of 10. Up next was a pleasant surprise in the form of Novocaine, starring Jack Quaid and Amber Midthunder, and it was just good fun all the way through. Telling the story of a man who can't feel pain in a world with no superheroes, this movie honestly did keep me on the edge of my reclined seat from when the action first started until the credits started rolling. Granted, the consequences at the end of the movie didn't seem very reasonable, especially considering how rushed it seemed, but I'm willing to cut it some slack given that it's meant to be an action based rom com, not a legal drama. Jack Quaid does great in his role, showing the trepidation to actually doing most of the stuff that he's doing, while also explaining how to fix or deal with some of the injuries that he inflicts on the villains in this movie. As long as you're not watching to nitpick every small detail, this is a great watch and it deservingly gets a 9 out of 10. For the first doubleheader of March, I started it off with Queen of the Ring, starring Emily Bett Rickards, who some of you might know as Felicity Smoke from the Arrowverse shows on the CW from a while ago. Damn, I didn't realize those started in 2012. Anyway, in telling the story of the first female professional wrestler and her rise to stardom, it was one of those weird instances where the story was good, but the rest of the movie made the story painful to watch. The acting was okay for most of the cast, but then the cast got so bloated with secondary, tertiary, and even quaternary and quinary characters that it just felt off. The editing also left a lot to be desired, with some scenes only lasting 15 to 30 seconds before cutting to a new scene entirely. A lot of the subplots really went nowhere, and there was so much terminology that was thrown out and never amounted to anything at the end of the movie, so while it was decent, it wasn't great, sitting in the middle of the road in terms of quality at a 5 out of 10. Following that up, we had Mickey 17, the latest film from director Bong Joon-ho, starring Robert Pattinson, Mark Ruffalo, and a few other prominent people. I will say, while it was good, I feel as though it was slightly overhyped due to the director's previous works, which include Snowpiercer and Parasite. Don't get me wrong, though, it was still a fun watch. Robert Pattinson did great as Mickey's 17 and 18, showing multiple sides to two people who are essentially the same character, just with different life experiences. What really threw me off was Mark Ruffalo's acting throughout the movie, and I get that he was supposed to be a crazy politician, but it just felt strange, and I don't really know how else to explain it. The story was fairly typical spacefaring sci fi weirdness, but in a good way this time, at least. It was a solid movie, and I guess for that, it'll get a solid 7.5 out of 10. The next day, I went and saw Magazine Dreams, the movie starring Jonathan Majors that was supposed to put him back on the radar, and I have no clue what the critics were smoking when they saw this movie because it is not good. Like, just no. I don't know if it's because I'm not the target audience for this movie, but this legitimately felt like it was just an excuse to have Jonathan Majors in a bodybuilder thong for about 75% of the runtime. The story builds up subplots only for them to not matter after two more scenes, and the last two acts of the movie stem from a completely random coincidence that kicks off a whole mess of other problems for the main character, which is all I can really say without getting too far into spoiler territory. There's a few other things that I just straight up did not like with this movie, but I just didn't care for this movie at all. So much build up for no payoff. And if I hadn't paid for the ticket, it might have been my first DNF ever, and I sat through Borderlands and Madam Web last year. It will be added to the list of movies where the more I think about them, the angrier I get, and those never get over a 2, with this being no exception. It gets a 1 out of 10, and I am moving on from it. Up next was the first in a long weekend of movies, a total of 8 in 5 days, an animated movie called Night of the Zoopocalypse. And yes, it was just as mid as the title would suggest. I'm not really trying to be mean when I say that, too. It's just kind of there. Like, yeah, it's a small studio kids movie, so the story, the acting is not really going to be on par with, say, a Marvel project or a SpongeBob movie or something, but still. There are so many things that just felt off about this from the get-go. Every single character felt way too exaggerated. The animation looked off. So I was more focused on that than I was on the actual movie itself. Side note though, how is this kiddie horror movie more scary than anything else that I've seen so far this year? The movie did commit one cardinal sin though, at least in my books. It tried to carry a bit throughout the whole movie and it just didn't work. The lemur that knows movies just wasn't it, and it was overplayed by the end of the first scene that he was in. Due to everything just being strange with this movie, it's going to sit at a 4 out of 10. Moving on to the first doubleheader of that weekend and the second of the month, I went and saw In the Lost Lands, the latest Paul W.S. Anderson flick starring Mila Jovovich and Dave Bautista, and I have to say it is very hard for me to care about a movie and its characters and the plot when the actors that are in said movie look and sound like they don't even want to be there in the first place, and that's exactly how it felt with this movie. The story and art direction were so blah that it felt like I was watching someone's Pinterest board from their edgy phase in high school. The plot was nonsensical, the reasoning behind everything made absolutely no sense, and it didn't help that some of the stupidest Chekhov's guns were used in the plot that it just did not make for an entertaining watch. For these reasons and more, it's getting a 2.5 from me, but it's still better than what I saw 2 movies ago, though not by much. The second movie of that night was Rule Breakers, a movie that told the true story of the Afghani girls robotics team from 2017. I was surprised that it managed to tell the story and represent a culture that is problematic both to Western eyes and the eyes of its own citizens in a way that is both critical and respectful at the same time. The acting was okay for the most part, with no standout performances from anybody, though the teenagers that they cast for the roles of the girls on the robotics team really did bring their best to their roles, both the humorous bits and the serious ones. Even though it is a fairly typical story of the underdog in a big competition, this movie will have you rooting for them every step of the way. The only gripe that I have with this is the extremely sped up exposition at the beginning, but that kind of had to be dealt with somehow. They just could have done a slightly better job with it, and the movie would have been better for it. I would watch this again, if only to cheer on those girls again, even knowing the outcome of the movie, and it'll get a well-deserved 8 out of 10. Following that up the next day with another quasi-doubleheader, I started off with The Day the Earth Blew Up, a Looney Tunes movie. And it was exactly the kind of goof shit you'd expect from a Looney Tunes movie, but without Bugs Bunny. Does the plot make sense? God, no. Do the character motivations make sense? Absolutely not. Is the animation kind of funky at times? Yeah, I'd say so. Is it exactly what I wanted from a movie called The Day the Earth Blew Up? Absolutely yes. Although, as I said at the top of this, it is strange that they did not include Bugs Bunny, arguably the most recognizable of the Looney Tunes in this movie. All in all, this is a great movie to turn your brain off and watch for an hour and a half, and it's great for kids and adults alike, landing it at a solid 7.5 out of 10. After taking a brief 2-hour break to rest my eyes and grab some food, I caught The Rule of Jenny Penn, a suspenseful horror movie starring Jeffrey Rush and John Lithgow. As with quite a few movies over the last couple of years, this is one that I walked out of thinking, what the hell did I just watch? But in a good way. It's just creepy event after creepy event after creepy event, and seeing these events unfold through the eyes of Jeffrey Rush's character, who seems to be the only sane person in the facility he's in throughout the events of the movie, just heightens the what the fuck factor as John Lithgow's character grows more and more unhinged as the movie progresses. The main word that I would use to describe this movie is just unsettling in the best way possible. The pacing could have used some work, especially towards the end, but it was still a good movie overall, with it getting 8 creepy-ass therapy dolls out of 10. With that, we are halfway through the month, and I'm just under halfway done with the movies I've seen. The next day, another doubleheader started with Opus, a culty thriller starring Ayo Edebiri and John Malkovich. And if I were to look up weird cult shit on Wikipedia, one of the results would most likely be this movie, I swear to God. Following a journalist invited on a weekend getaway to listen to a reclusive musician's newest album, this movie is a trip from start to finish, though at least to me it could have ended about 15 minutes earlier and been a better conclusion. Ayo Edebiri and John Malkovich do great in their roles as journalists and artists respectively, though the artist's character takes a sharp turn towards the middle of the second act that threw me for quite the loop, if I'm being honest. It didn't hurt my enjoyment of the movie too much, but it did take me out of the movie a few times, and those few times knocked it from a potential 8 to a 6.5 out of 10. Ending the third doubleheader of the weekend was Black Bag, a spy thriller of the truest sort starring Michael Fassbender, Cate Blanchett, Pierce Brosnan, and Regé-Jean Page, or as I called them, Magneto, Hela, James Bond, and Zank, the paladin guy from the D&D movie from 2023. Weirdly enough, though, this was one of the few instances of me wishing that a movie was instead made into a TV show. Don't get me wrong, the movie is a great spy thriller that actually focuses on spying rather than killing, although that does happen. My main problem is that it doesn't allow the viewer to actually care about any of the characters, instead thrusting us right into the action from quite literally the first scene, and not really giving us any time to breathe until the credits roll. That being said, Michael Fassbender and Cate Blanchett in the lead roles have amazing chemistry that is actually believable, and the supporting cast does great in their own roles. The story is mildly standard fare, but it does well with the time that it is given within the constraints of an hour-and-a-half long movie. I just wish that we could have had longer to get to know these characters and this world, because it seems so interesting, but it just goes by so quickly, and for that reason alone, it goes from a 10 to a 9 out of 10. Ending the stretch of 8 movies in 5 days, I had the absolute pleasure of seeing The Penguin Lessons, starring Steve Coogan and Jonathan Pryce. Now, when you hear the name of the movie, The Penguin Lessons, you might think it's some cutesy animated movie about a school of penguins learning some valuable lessons about life. Not a coup-struck Argentinian boys' school in the 1970s following a man who had unwillingly adopted a penguin. It was just such a good story based on true events that were actually shown in the end credits, and the acting was solid from the whole cast, including the kids that had been cast as the students. I would highly recommend it to anyone who just wants a feel-good movie that's willing to learn or a thing or two about life, some of the inner workings of the 1976 military coup in Argentina, and grief, surprisingly enough, but that's getting into spoiler territory, so I'll leave it at that, giving it my first 10 out of 10 for the year. Up next was Ash, a sci-fi horror thriller starring Eiza Gonzalez and Aaron Paul. I have to say, first off, how can a movie that's only an hour and a half feel like so much longer and shorter at the same time? This movie was basically an hour and a half drug trip gone bad, with so many flashing lights it made me look away so much I basically missed a sixth of the total runtime. A basic sci-fi thriller plot with decent acting isn't enough to save what could have been an interesting movie. I will say, though, it did have some decent jump scares and legitimately unnerving moments, but there was also so much left unexplained, such as the magical space butthole, which, yes, is a real thing, that I left with only one question. What did I just watch? It just was not that good of a movie, and all of the TikTok ads I've seen for it must have seen a different version, because at least for me, it gets a 3.5 out of 10. Starting off the fourth doubleheader of March, I saw the first documentary that I've voluntarily seen in a while, if ever, October 8, which detailed the rise of anti Semitism across college campuses in the US following the October 7th, 2023 attack against Israel by Hamas. Having seen few documentaries and given the subject matter of the film itself, I'm not entirely sure how to properly review this. As a documentary, it did well to tell the facts of what happened in the covered event with very little exaggeration of them. It's also mildly telling that they had to use a smaller distribution company, especially given the subject matter. It went into great detail with regard to what happened, while also giving first-hand accounts from people who were directly affected by what happened, as well as those that were affected by the aftermath on their campuses. I think it was a worthwhile watch, but I will be reluctant to see it again, which I want to say was kind of the point. For their attention to the facts over exaggeration, I'll be giving this a 9 out of 10. The second movie of the fourth doubleheader was none other than Disney's Snow White remake, starring Rachel Zegler and Gal Gadot. And I just have to say, before I get to the meat of the review, that neither the acting nor the singing from Gal Gadot was as bad as other people are saying. Maybe it's just because I've seen worse this month, or because I had heard those and wanted to see it for myself, but it wasn't terrible. It wasn't great by any stretch of the imagination, but it wasn't terrible. Anyway, for the main part of this review, while it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, Snow White does not justify its existence in the hour and a half that it was given. The music was fine, same with the acting, but the majority of the movie being very clearly on a soundstage, with about half the characters on screen being CGI, being the animals and the dwarves, about a half hour of subplots that were just added to meet the hour and a half benchmark of current movies, and half the songs being reprises just made the whole thing feel off. It was just uncanny valley moment after uncanny valley moment, and it just made it feel strange to watch. This movie also felt oddly cheap, given that it's a Disney production. Each character had one, maybe two costumes at best, and even then they looked like something that you would get at Party City, not something that was paid for using the trademarked Disney bucks. Just like how this movie never justified its existence to me, I can't really justify calling it anything better than slightly worse than mid, meaning that it gets a 4.5, and it's just going to have to stay there. Sunday's movie for the third week of March turned out to be The Assessment, starring Elizabeth Olsen, Himesh Patel, and Alicia Vikander. Set in a post-apocalypse world where reproduction is strictly regulated, this movie does a great job of explaining just enough to allow the viewer to understand what is going on, without giving away too much too quickly. The main cast were absolutely phenomenal in their roles, with Vikander doing a kind of dual role with her character. The story goes off the rails almost immediately, but that's to be expected when you understand what's going on, but I won't spoil that here. What is supposed to be a happy time in this couple's life turns dark fairly quickly, and it ends just as dark. However, as with seemingly every futuristic / sci-fi project nowadays, they needed to include flashing lights and random cuts to bright cue cards from dark scenes, which had to be my only gripe with the movie. I feel like the movie could have ended about 10 to 15 minutes earlier than it did, but with the explanation of why everything happened in the way that it did and showing everything that followed, it felt like they just needed to pad the runtime a bit to get up to a quote-unquote acceptable film length. Taking the unnecessary extended ending, the flashing lights, and the random bright-ass cue cards, those combined bring what could have been a 10 out of 10 down to an 8.5 out of 10. Ending the third week of movies was Locked, a psychological thriller film starring Bill Skarsgård and Sir Anthony Hopkins. Oddly philosophical for a thriller movie about a guy locked in a car, roll credits. This movie was your standard guy does something wrong, gets tortured by the guy he wronged movie. The through line for the plot was there, I guess, but it wasn't nearly as strong as I thought it would be or could have been. It also doesn't help that any explanation we might get of what's going on is negated by Bill Skarsgård's character falling asleep in the middle of the exposition. The acting was fine, but not great, though Bill's accent slipped quite a few times throughout the movie. Though it has to be said that Anthony Hopkins was just having the time of his life in his role as the torturer, which was very fun to hear. Overall, it was a solidly okay movie, so it'll get a 6 out of 10, being just slightly better than mid. Starting off the last week of movies for the month was Audrey's Children, a biopic about Dr. Audrey Evans, starring Natalie Dormer, Jimmy Simpson, and Clancy Brown. Right off the bat, I have to say watching a biopic like Audrey's Children, I'm reminded of all the jobs that I could have had if I chose that, but damn, I am so glad I did not choose pediatric oncology or being a doctor of children's cancer. I just wouldn't be able to do it. The emotional stress of it all would have gotten to me after just a few months. In terms of the actual movie, it was simply brilliant. The whole cast was great, and the story was fantastic as well. Something that isn't shown in a lot of the movies actually happened here. Consequences for breaking the rules, but with the person doling out the consequences understanding why Audrey did what she did. Plus, the movie had Clancy Brown, and who can get mad at a project that has Mr. Krabs in it? So, hell yeah, Dr. Audrey Evans, and please, if you can, watch this movie. It will hurt, but damn if it isn't important to see. I damn near started crying in the theater, and that wasn't even the true end of the movie. It was simply perfect, and for that, it gets the second 10 out of 10 for the year. Up next was one of the most Jason Statham movies of all time, A Working Man, and it was exactly the kind of dumb action movie you would think it was from seeing the trailer, but not in a bad way. More fleshed out than some of his other works, Statham puts on a good performance as a Wolverine-like character, someone who is really good at what he does, but what he does isn't very nice. The story is actually coherent and makes sense, though its need to almost have set up for a sequel might hurt it being a standalone action romp. Overall, though, it was a fairly decent movie and one that I'd watch again if I had nothing better to do and it was the only thing available on streaming. But that's not really a bad thing. It was good enough to keep my attention throughout the whole thing, and it was entertaining, so it'll get a 7 out of 10. Finishing out the month of March on its last day was Death of a Unicorn, starring Paul Rudd, Jenna Ortega, and Will Poulter, amongst various others. And I don't know. Another A24 movie, another movie where I'm thinking, what the fuck is even happening throughout the duration, though I'm not sure if it's in a good or bad way this time. The cast does great in their roles, with Jenna Ortega and Will Poulter being the two standout characters here, though I'm confused as to why Richard E. Grant kept his accent for the film, while Will Poulter didn't. Just an odd choice for me. I will say that I wholeheartedly disagree with the ending of the movie, though. When Paul Rudd's character makes the same choice throughout the duration of the movie to neglect his daughter's wishes, it's going to make more than a half-assed explanation in the third act to make me okay with his choices. It just frustrated me, and it hurt the rest of the movie from that point onwards, which basically killed the enjoyment of the whole third act for me. When you do that, I just can't give this movie any better than 2/3 of a score, so it'll get just below that at 6.5 out of 10. In the month of March, I saw a total of 21 movies for an average rating of 6.6. I walked into 3 of those movies not knowing what they were, being Novocaine, Magazine Dreams, and The Penguin Lessons. Unfortunately, I did end up having to pay for quite a few of these movies, given that I only got 12 of them for free, but I still saved $176.13 compared to the $66.95 that I spent on tickets. A real quick recap in order of quality, according to me, we had Penguin Lessons and Audrey's Children tied at 10, Novocaine, Black Bag, and October 8 all tied at 9, The Assessment at 8.5, Rule Breakers and The Rule of Jenny Penn tied at 8, Mickey 17 and The Day the Earth Blew Up tied at 7.5. A Working Man at 7. Opus and Death of a Unicorn both at 6.5. Locked at 6. Queen of the Ring at 5. Ash and Snow White at 4.5. Cleaner and Night of the Zoopocalypse at 4. In the Lost Lands at 2.5. And finally, Magazine Dreams falling in at 1. As before, if you want a full, spoiler-filled review of any of these, feel free to ask, and you may get it, depending on life stuff that may or may not get in the way. Up next will be the month of April, and if it's anything like this month, and it was, it will be absolutely insane with the amount of movies that I saw. As of starting the script on April Fool's Day, I've seen one movie already, and yeah. The start of the next video will be, interesting, to say the least. But until then, I will see you in the next one, and who knows, maybe you'll see something that I saw. Happy viewing.